Hello. Have you ever thought that history drifts quietly, one century at a time, recorded by the victors, summarized by those who come later, and simplified, so it can be easily understood? But sometimes, between timelines we assume have already closed, there are things that refuse to stay still, structures that are too precise, knowledge that is too complex, systems of thought that appear far too early for what we believe that era should have been capable of. They do not shout. They do not claim to be mysteries. They simply exist, and it is that very existence that makes us uncomfortable. Because if they truly were created by ancient people, then it means we have underestimated them far more than we are willing to admit. And if they were not, then the question becomes even harder to answer. Tonight, we are not here to prove anything. We are also not here to dismiss anything too quickly. We will do something simpler than that. We will place the evidence side by side and listen carefully to what history is whispering. This is the story of ancient discoveries that should not exist at the time they do. There is a quiet but persistent assumption embedded in the way we look at the past, that ancient people worked with rough hands, that they built through intuition, through oral experience, and with tools so simple that absolute precision would have been impossible, that whatever survives from thousands of years ago must inevitably bear the marks of clumsiness, inaccuracy, and improvisation. We rarely state this assumption out loud, but it exists as an invisible foundation beneath most popular historical narratives. That assumption begins to falter, not when we encounter large structures, but when we encounter structures that are too correct, not because of their sheer size, but because every small detail within them seems to allow no margin for error. Too flat, too square, too uniform, as if they were not built merely to stand, but to obey a strict geometric standard, a standard we are not accustomed to attributing to the ancient world. On the cold, dry plateau of Bolivia, nearly 4,000 meters above sea level, lies an ancient site scattered among wind and stone. There are no towering statues meant to overwhelm the eye, no soaring pyramids visible from miles away. This place does not try to impress, and precisely because of that, it is difficult to ignore. The ruins are known as Pumapunku. At first glance, Pumapunku looks like a disorderly pile of debris. Large stone blocks lie low to the ground, separated, as if a once complete structure had been dismantled and abandoned on the plateau. There is no obvious order to guide the observer's gaze. No architectural focal point that demands immediate attention. Everything here seems to resist quick understanding, photogenic framing, or neat classification into a single descriptive sentence. But as one moves closer, as the cold wind settles and sunlight glides across the stone surfaces, something else begins to emerge. The stones cease to appear as inert masses. They begin to reveal a level of order that is difficult to explain. Edges are so straight that light reflects evenly along them without breaks or wavering. Surfaces are so flat that it is nearly impossible to slide even a thin blade between adjoining blocks. Angles approach perfect right angles, not in one isolated case, but repeated across dozens of blocks as if all were produced according to the same invisible geometric system. The first reaction is not amazement, but confusion, because the modern eye associates precision with machinery. We are accustomed to flawless cuts because we know steel engines and measuring tools accurate to fractions of a millimeter stand behind them. But at Pumapunku, there is no evidence of any such mechanisms, no circular saw marks, no striations from metal blades, no signs that these stones were shaped by tools driven by modern mechanical systems. What appears instead is consistency. grooves of nearly identical depth, holes placed in repeating positions with minimal deviation. Many blocks are shaped like the letter H, a form that is not merely aesthetic, but functional. It allows stones to interlock, structurally locking into place without mortar or binding agents. This is not an arbitrary shape. It reflects a way of thinking that anticipated joints load distribution and long-term stability across an entire structure. What makes Pumapunku unusual is not how well a single stone was shaped, but how consistently that level of precision appears across the site. Any variation, if present at all, is negligible. This suggests that the builders were not working intuitively, adjusting each block independently on site. They were following a pre-established standard, one clear enough that different individuals working at different times could produce stones that fit together seamlessly. At this altitude, the air is thin. The climate is harsh. Temperatures fluctuate dramatically between day and night. Simply surviving and working here is already a challenge. Yet under these conditions, the builders did not choose the easier path. They did not construct rough walls. They did not accept uneven stone surfaces as long as they held. They pursued precision, not necessary precision, but precision beyond necessity. And it is here that Pumapunku begins to unsettle familiar historical narratives. If this were merely a utilitarian structure, such meticulousness would be unnecessary. But if it carried symbolic ritual or cosmological significance, then precision would not be optional. In that context, deviation would not be a technical flaw. It would be a rupture of order itself. Standing among these stones, one has the impression that Pumapunku was not built to impress human observers. It seems constructed for a different frame of reference, one in which straightness, flatness, and repetition carried meanings deeper than practicality, and when the structure collapsed, was dismantled, or was abandoned by those who built it, what remained was not an answer, but a question that persists to this day. Have we truly understood the skill, motivation, and worldview of the people who once stood here in the cold wind of the plateau, carefully grinding each stone edge until it reached a level of precision that time itself has not erased? Many of the blocks share the H-shaped design, allowing them to lock together without mortar. This is not decorative chance, but an advanced structural solution. When two H blocks are placed side by side, their stepped joints interlock, precisely distributing stress evenly across contact surfaces. This structure not only increases resistance to time and seismic activity, but shows that the designers conceived of the stones as parts of a unified system, not as isolated elements stacked together. The grooves, holes, and stepped joints are cut with astonishing uniformity. They share nearly identical depths. Their edges are clean and straight. Intersecting angles are crisp, not rounded by carelessness or random wear. When different blocks are placed next to one another, it becomes clear that these features follow the same geometric language as if they were produced from a shared blueprint, replicated repeatedly with minimal deviation. Crucially, these traits are not confined to a handful of especially refined stones. They appear throughout the entire site. This repetition eliminates coincidence and compels us to view Pumapunku as a deliberately organized system, not an improvised construction. The real puzzle is not how heavy the stones are, though many weigh dozens of tons and had to be transported across difficult terrain. Weight is a physical challenge. The deeper confusion lies in how the stones were shaped. According to current archaeological understanding, the builders of Pumapunku had no iron, no steel, no mechanical cutting machines, no engines, no gears, and no modern measuring tools as we define them. They worked with stone, with relatively soft copper, with sand as an abrasive, with water to cool and clean surfaces, and most importantly, with time, vast amounts of time. In this context, every precise cut was not the result of a quick operation, but of hours, days, even months of patient grinding. Every small error had to be corrected by hand. There was no room for good enough. This indicates that the stoneworkers were not simply completing tasks, but striving toward a predetermined standard, a standard strict enough to require continued refinement until blocks fit together perfectly, even when such effort offered no immediate practical advantage. Here discomfort arises, because the results they left behind display a level of precision that makes many medieval and even early modern structures built with metal tools appear like unfinished sketches by comparison. This is not meant to diminish later civilizations, but to underscore something else. Precision does not always correlate with linear technological progress. There are moments in history when societies concentrate immense intellectual and physical energy on a single objective. When they do, the outcome can exceed what we expect from their technological context. The stones of Pumapunku are therefore not merely remnants of a collapsed structure. They are evidence of a worldview that treated precision as an intrinsic value. A worldview in which geometry, order, and perfect fit were not luxuries, but requirements. And when that worldview disappeared for reasons we do not fully understand, what remained was not lost technology, but silent stone blocks that continue to challenge how we narrate human capability in the past. Archaeologists do not deny that technically such work is possible. Stone can be shaped by harder stone. Sand can serve as an abrasive. Water can cool and clean surfaces. Organized labor sustained over years or generations can achieve what no individual could alone. On paper, it all makes sense. But the question that makes Pumapunku unsettling is not how it was done. It is why it needed to be done to this degree. The precision seen here was not required to build a windbreak. It was unnecessary for shelter. It exceeds survival needs. It resembles an internal standard, a rule the builders felt compelled to follow, even at great cost of effort and time. This suggests that Pumapunku was built not merely to function, but to align with an order perhaps ritual symbolic or cosmological in nature. When faced with structures like this, modern observers often fall into a familiar reflex. If we do not understand how something was done, we assume it could not have been done. And when evidence shows that it was, we begin searching for explanations outside humanity, lost technologies, vanished, advanced civilizations, or forces external to known history. This reflex does not arise from gullibility, but from discomfort, from the difficulty of accepting that people without electricity machines or modern science could achieve levels of precision we still admire. Yet there is another possibility, simpler and far more unsettling. That ancient people were not as crude as we imagine, that they possessed what we rarely do today, unfragmented time, cultivated patience across a lifetime, and a deep relationship with material built through prolonged observation rather than speed. A stoneworker who spends decades working with a single type of stone develops a geometric intuition without formulas. A community that adheres to the same standards across generations produces uniformity without machines. At Pumapunku, evidence suggests the stones were not crafted individually, but according to a consistent system. Dimensions repeat. Spacing remains uniform. Joints follow the same geometric logic. This indicates planning rules and standards that builders were expected to meet. We often associate standardization with industrial societies, with factories, blueprints, interchangeable parts, and the logic of mass production. We imagine standards as something born from machines, from the need to make thousands of identical objects quickly and efficiently. In that framework, precision becomes a byproduct of speed, and uniformity becomes a necessity of scale. Puma Punku quietly challenges that assumption. It reminds us that standardization does not require industry. It can emerge wherever order itself is considered sacred, where consistency is not a convenience, but a value, where repetition is not about efficiency, but about alignment. In such societies, deviation is not merely an error, it is a violation of meaning. Here, standardization may not have been imposed by economics or technology, but by worldview. When a culture believes that structure reflects cosmic order, that geometry mirrors the universe, or that precise alignment maintains balance between realms, then precision becomes a moral obligation. Under those conditions, uniformity does not arise from machinery. It arises from belief, discipline, and collective agreement sustained across generations. What makes Puma Punku truly haunting, then, is not that it contradicts science. It does not demand new physics. It does not invalidate archaeology. Its stones obey gravity. Its construction methods remain technically plausible. What it disrupts instead is our psychological comfort with simple historical narratives. The narrative that history always advances in a straight line from primitive to advanced, from crude to refined, from ignorance to knowledge. A narrative that reassures us that the present is always superior simply by virtue of being later in time. Puma Punku unsettles that reassurance. It suggests that history does not move smoothly forward, but unevenly, with peaks and valleys, accelerations, and collapses, moments of intense focus, followed by long periods of forgetting. It implies that refinement is not guaranteed by time alone, and that complexity can emerge early, then vanish, leaving behind results without their original context. It challenges the comforting belief that everything begins crude and gradually improves. Because here refinement appears suddenly fully formed and disciplined, not as an experiment, but as an established norm. There is no visible learning curve etched into the stone, no gradual progression from rough to precise. What remains suggests a system already mature when it was set into rock. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it confronts the assumption that the past must always be less capable than the present, that ancient people, lacking our tools and technologies, must therefore have lacked our precision, our planning, and our conceptual rigor. Puma Punku does not claim that the past was more advanced than we are, but it quietly insists that capability is not owned by any single era. That human potential does not unfold in a simple upward trajectory, and that intelligence, discipline, and order can manifest in forms that do not resemble our own. In this sense, Puma Punku does not ask us to rewrite history. It asks something far more uncomfortable to loosen our grip on certainty. To accept that the story of human development may be more fragmented, more fragile, and more non-linear than we prefer. And when we do that, when we stop forcing the past to fit neatly beneath the present, the stones of Puma Punku cease to be an anomaly. They become a reminder that history is not a ladder, but a landscape. Standing before these stones, we are forced to admit that there were periods in history when human achievement does not fit neatly into our evolutionary models, and that when those periods ended, not all knowledge was carried forward. This chapter does not end with an answer, nor with a dramatic declaration. It leaves only a sensation, the same sensation many researchers describe upon first touching the cold stones of Puma Punku. The feeling that we are seeing the result of a complete system of thought without possessing the full path that led to it. And it is precisely this absence, that makes Pumapunku one of those discoveries said to not belong to its time, not because it could not have been built, but because it forces us to reconsider how well we truly understand the people who stood here long ago. After the cold, precise stones of Pumapunku history does not allow us time to rest. It lifts our gaze away from the ground, away from geometry and weight, and forces it upward toward a more distant realm, the sky. If the first piece of evidence made us question the technical capabilities of ancient people, the second touches something even harder to grasp: their capacity for intellectual patience. Not patience in labor, but patience in observation. The patience required to watch the slow, repetitive movements of celestial bodies across many successive generations. On a wide, windswept plain in what is now England, a ring of stones stands silently beneath the open sky, as if accustomed to being seen, but rarely understood. This structure is known as Stonehenge. Stonehenge is often mentioned as a symbol of prehistoric mystery. But if we strip away the familiar veil of mysticism, what emerges is not ambiguity, but a structure astonishingly aligned with the sky. It does not turn its back on the surrounding world, nor does it face an arbitrary direction. The main axis of the stone circle aligns precisely with the point where the sun rises on the summer solstice, and where it sets on the winter solstice. These are not ordinary moments in the year. They are the two extremes of the light cycle, the longest day and the shortest day moments when the sun's movement appears to reach the very limits of its path. What matters here is this: these points do not appear randomly on the horizon. They can only be identified through repeated observation of the sun over many consecutive years, patiently remembering where it rises and sets each day, and gradually recognizing that there are days when it goes no farther. There is no indication that this moment reveals itself clearly to a first-time observer. It only emerges when humans accept waiting, when they allow time itself to reveal its patterns. The issue is not whether ancient people could recognize seasonal change. That is obvious to any community living close to nature. Cold arrives, then retreats. Heat lingers, then fades. Vegetation flourishes, then withers. These cycles are clear enough to guide hunting-gathering and later agriculture. But Stonehenge goes beyond mere recognition. It does not simply reflect change. It attempts to anchor change into space. Here, humans were not satisfied with knowing that a season would come. They wanted to know when, and they wanted to ensure that moment would not be forgotten, debated, or distorted by individual memory. By using stone, they transformed a fleeting phenomenon into a fixed reference point. Light touches that point only briefly each year. Yet, it is precisely that rarity which renders the moment sacred. The decision to freeze time in stone was not a practical one. It required enormous labor organized across multiple generations. Those who placed the first stones likely knew they would never see the structure completed. They were not working for the present, but for a future they could only imagine. This reveals that Stonehenge was not merely a structure, but a long-term commitment to cosmic order, a promise that humans would continue to return, continue to observe, and continue to maintain that alignment through time. Seen this way, Stonehenge ceases to be simply an observatory. It becomes a declaration that time is not allowed to pass anonymously, that certain moments in the year deserve the entire community to stop, look upward, and acknowledge that their lives are bound to the slow movements of the sky. By marking those moments with stone, astronomy became part of lived space, not a detached intellectual pursuit. It is at this point that Stonehenge moves beyond survival needs. a simple marker could signal the seasons. An oral tradition could remind a community when to plant or harvest. But Stonehenge chose enduring precision over convenience. It placed its trust in geometry repetition and the capacity of future generations to maintain a standard they did not create themselves but inherited and continued. Standing before those stones, one senses that Stonehenge was not built to solve an immediate problem, but to answer a deeper question. Where do humans stand within the vast cycles of the universe? And to answer that question, they invested the most valuable resource they possessed, not material, but time stretched across many lifetimes, slow, precise, and intolerant of haste. For an early agricultural society, determining the seasons was essential. No one disputes that. Planting too early or too late could result in crop failure, famine, and instability. Yet the degree of precision expressed at Stonehenge far exceeds practical necessity. A crude marker driven into the ground, a row of wooden posts aligned with the sun, or even a natural feature on the horizon would have sufficed. Those solutions were simple, labor efficient, and well suited to a resource-limited society. And yet the people here chose the most complex path. They chose stone not because it was convenient, but because it was durable. They chose geometry not because it was easy, but because it was precise. They created a stone astronomical calendar, heavy, immovable, and nearly permanent. That decision shows they did not merely want to know when seasons changed. They wanted to control the meaning of that change. They wanted to transform time normally invisible and fleeting into something visible, tangible, and repeatable across generations. Once time is carved into stone, it no longer belongs to individual memory. It becomes communal property. No one can arbitrarily alter the solstice once it has been fixed by silent standing stones. In this context, a calendar is no longer just a measuring tool. It becomes the foundation of social order. Whoever controls the interpretation of the calendar controls when people work, when they rest, when rituals occur, and when a moment is declared sacred. When we widen our view beyond Europe, this pattern proves far from unique. In Mesoamerica, thousands of kilometers away and completely disconnected historically, another civilization left behind evidence of the same obsession with the sky. The Maya did not observe only the sun. They tracked the moon, Venus, and complex cycles lasting hundreds, even thousands of years. For them, the sky was not a backdrop to life, but an ordered system with rhythm and predictability. They built pyramids and temples so that sunlight on very specific days would strike precise stairways, doorways, or pre-calculated symbols. At Chichen Itza, during the spring and autumn, equinoxes, light and shadow, combined to create the illusion of a serpent slithering down the steps of the El Castillo pyramid. This phenomenon is brief. It is easy to miss if one does not stand in exactly the right place, and it provides no immediate practical benefit for agriculture at that moment. Yet, it repeats with precision year after year, a reminder that cosmic order continues to operate as predicted. What deserves reflection is these light phenomena are not accidental. They require deep understanding of solar angles, site positioning, and precise timing within the year. A slight error in orientation, elevation, or stair design would cause the entire effect to vanish. This shows that architecture and astronomy were integrated from the outset, not arbitrarily joined later. Like Stonehenge, the Maya astronomical system extended beyond a single lifetime. The cycles they tracked, especially those of Venus, were so long that no individual could observe them in full. This required knowledge to be passed down, tested, corrected, and preserved with strict discipline. Errors were not merely personal mistakes. They represented breaks in the cosmic order the community trusted. When Stonehenge and Maya astronomical monuments are placed side by side, a shared pattern emerges. These were not societies concerned only with surviving the next winter or harvesting enough food for the coming year. They were societies invested in understanding and defining time. They refused to let time pass vaguely. They forced it to obey geometry, light, and stone. And this is what makes ancient astronomical knowledge appear as something that should not exist according to our usual historical expectations. Not because it could not be created, but because it raises an uncomfortable question. Why did societies we still label as primitive devote such energy to long, precise cosmic cycles when immediate survival did not demand it? That question does not require a rushed answer. It only needs to remain suspended, like sunlight striking a single stone step on one specific day of the year, rare, precise, and sufficient to make the observer pause and think. What makes Maya astronomical knowledge difficult to comprehend is not its accuracy, but the time it spans. Some of their calendar systems extend far beyond a single lifetime, even beyond the lifespan of dynasties. To build and maintain such systems, they required extraordinarily stable mechanisms of knowledge transmission, where small errors were detected, recorded, and corrected across generations. This reveals that ancient astronomy was not an isolated intellectual hobby. It was a carefully protected collective tradition. Here a quiet question arises. Why did societies we often call early invest so much energy in such long cosmic cycles? Why did they need to understand not only today or this year, but distant repeating patterns far into the future? The familiar answer is religion, that the sky was tied to gods, rituals, and cosmic order. Yet even when we accept this, the level of systematization and precision still forces modern observers to slow down. In these societies, astronomy did not exist independently. It was embedded directly into architecture, ritual, and power. Those who controlled the calendar controlled time. And those who controlled time in societies deeply dependent on seasons and ritual held an invisible, yet absolute form of authority. Still, the discomfort remains. Because to achieve this level of precision observation could not have been the work of a few exceptional individuals. It required a long-term observational tradition where data was remembered, compared, and continuously corrected. A small error in a single year might go unnoticed. Over decades, it would become obvious. Maintaining and correcting such errors shows that these societies were not merely observing the sky, they were testing themselves against it. This is what makes the second piece of evidence feel as though it should not exist within conventional historical thinking. Not because it violates physical laws, and not because it requires unknown tools, but because it unsettles one of our most comfortable assumptions that complex knowledge is always a byproduct of advanced technology. We are accustomed to believing that precision follows invention, that careful measurement requires instruments, that long-term calculation demands writing systems, clocks, and mechanical aids. In this framework, knowledge is imagined as something unlocked by tools progressing step by step alongside material innovation. Stonehenge and ancient astronomical calendars quietly reverse that order. They suggest that under certain conditions, knowledge can come first, not as abstract theory, but as accumulated understanding embedded in practice. When people are willing to observe patiently, to compare outcomes across years, and to preserve patterns across generations, technology becomes helpful, but not essential. Time itself becomes the measuring instrument. Memory becomes the archive. Repetition becomes verification. In such contexts, discipline replaces machinery, consistency replaces speed, and precision emerges not from cutting-edge tools, but from refusal to accept approximation. Stonehenge did not require advanced devices to mark the solstices. It required generations willing to watch the same horizon year after year and to treat small deviations as meaningful rather than negligible. Ancient calendars did not demand instant calculation. They demanded continuity, a commitment to pass observations forward without distortion, even when their full significance would only become clear long after the observer was gone. This kind of knowledge develops slowly, but once established, it can be remarkably stable. It does not depend on individual brilliance alone, but on collective restraint, the willingness not to improvise, not to simplify, and not to forget. From this perspective, ancient astronomy does not appear premature. It appears misunderstood. It does not belong to a world racing toward innovation, but to one structured around patience. A world where understanding was measured not by how quickly something could be discovered, but by how reliably it could be preserved. And it is precisely because modern historical thinking privileges speed, efficiency, and technological causality that evidence like this feels out of place. Not because it contradicts history, but because it challenges the lens through which we usually interpret it. Stonehenge and early astronomical systems remind us that progress is not a single path, that intelligence does not unfold in only one sequence, and that there have been moments in human history when knowing slowly but deeply was not a limitation, but a deliberate choice. They also show that progress does not always mean knowing more. Sometimes it only means knowing faster, while ancient people knew slowly but profoundly. Standing before stone circles, solar alignments, and star-calculated stairways, one cannot escape a strange feeling that there were moments in the past when humans looked at the sky not with fleeting curiosity, but with nearly infinite patience. And it is precisely that patience which has left traces that compel us, thousands of years later, to ask whether we truly understand the motivations and vision of those who lived according to the slow rhythm of the universe. After stone and sky history brings us to another kind of evidence, thinner, more fragile, yet no less unsettling maps. If architecture suggests that ancient people understood space through geometry and astronomy, suggests that they understood time through cycles, then maps suggest that they understood the world as a measurable whole. And it is here that a quiet paradox emerges. At the beginning of the 16th century, when Europe was still feeling its way along unfamiliar coastlines, an Ottoman admiral drew a map that would force many later generations to pause and think. That map is known as the Piri Reis map. At first glance, the Piri Reis map does not appear especially unusual. It is incomplete. It does not cover the entire world. It is only a surviving fragment showing the coasts of Europe, Africa, and most strikingly, the eastern coastline of South America. But when modern researchers began comparing those shorelines with today's geographic data, a faint discomfort began to form. Certain stretches of coastline appear with surprising accuracy, not as crude approximations, but with proportions and contours that align fairly closely with reality. At first glance, the Piri Reis map does not appear especially unusual. It is incomplete. It does not cover the entire world. It is only a surviving fragment showing the coasts of Europe, Africa, and most strikingly, the eastern coastline of South America. But when modern researchers began comparing those shorelines with today's geographic data, a faint discomfort began to form. Certain stretches of coastline appear, with surprising accuracy, not as crude approximations, but with proportions and contours that align fairly closely with reality. What makes this map controversial is not where it is correct, but when it was drawn. In 1513, reliable techniques for measuring longitude at sea did not yet exist in the modern sense. Latitude could be determined by the stars, but longitude, the factor that shapes coastlines along the east-west axis, remained a problem without a precise solution. And yet on the Piri Reis map, some coastal lines show a balance and directional consistency beyond what one would normally expect from that period. Piri Reis himself offers an important clue. He does not claim that he invented these coastlines. In notes on the map, he states that he compiled it from multiple sources: Arab maps, Portuguese maps, and even older maps he refers to collectively as maps of the ancients. That detail opens a larger question. If Piri Reis's map is a compilation, then where did the originals disappear to? Here the discomfort does not come from imagining that someone in the past possessed modern surveying technology. It comes from the possibility that geographic knowledge once existed in scattered forms, accumulated gradually, piece by piece, and then lost over time. A precise coastline does not require satellites. It requires many voyages, many observations, repeated measurements, and a tradition of record-keeping long enough for errors to be detected and corrected. When we look back at maritime history, this is not entirely implausible. Before modern science sailors learned to read currents, wind stars, and the shapes of coastlines with a sensitivity modern people rarely need to develop, such knowledge was often not written into formal books. It was passed orally, recorded in fragments, and kept within closed professional communities. When a civilization declined, that knowledge could vanish faster than any structure made of stone. For this reason, the Piri Reis map is not evidence of out-of-place technology, but evidence of a break in collective memory. It shows that the history of knowledge is not a straight line upward, but a tangled network in which information can be accumulated, copied, distorted, and then lost. When we encounter a map that seems too accurate, it may not be because the mapmaker knew too much, but because we have forgotten too much. What makes this piece of evidence feel as though it should not exist in the way we usually think about history is that it disrupts the assumption that geographic knowledge can only reach high precision once science and technology are fully prepared. The Piri Reis map suggests that accuracy can appear in fragments at different times in different contexts, and then be buried under layers of time until it is accidentally found again. When you hold an ancient map in your hands, you do not see only coastlines. You see journeys no one remembers, measurements no one can fully explain anymore, and decisions of documentation that no one is left to defend. And that is what makes maps like the Piri Reis map a quiet reminder the world may once have been understood in ways that today we can only glimpse through scattered fragments. The third piece of evidence, therefore, does not force us to believe in anything extraordinary. It forces us to acknowledge something more modest, that the history of human knowledge is full of gaps, and sometimes it is precisely those gaps that make a fragile map feel unbearably heavy. Here again, the discomfort does not come from imagining that someone in the past had modern surveying technology. It comes from the possibility that geographic knowledge once existed in scattered forms, was accumulated gradually, and then was lost over time. A precise coastline does not require satellites. It requires many voyages, careful observation, repeated measurements, and a long record-keeping tradition, so that errors can be discovered and corrected. When we look back at maritime history, this is not entirely irrational. Before modern science, sailors learned to read currents, wind stars, and coastlines with a sensitivity modern people rarely have to train. Such knowledge was rarely preserved as formal academic learning. It lived in sailors' experience, in fragile, hand-copied maps in the memory of navigators, and within closed professional communities. When a civilization declined, that knowledge could vanish faster than any monument built of stone. That is why the Peary race map is not proof of technology ahead of its time, but proof of the rupture of collective memory. It shows that the history of knowledge is not a straight path upward, but a dense web where information can be accumulated, copied, altered, and then lost. When we see a map that appears too accurate, it may not be, because the mapmaker knew too much, but because we have forgotten too much. What makes this evidence feel as though it should not exist by our usual standards is that it undermines the assumption that geographic knowledge can only become highly precise once science and technology are ready. The Peary race map suggests that precision can appear in pieces at different times in different settings, and then be buried beneath dust and time until it is unexpectedly recovered. When you hold an ancient map in your hands, you do not see only coastlines. Those ink lines are not merely the shapes of land and sea. They are traces of voyages whose starting points no one remembers clearly anymore, of ships that left port without leaving complete journals, of people who measured the world with their eyes, their experience, and their willingness to risk everything rather than with finished formulas. Within every curve of a coastline, there may be hundreds of landings, hundreds of adjustments to small errors, and hundreds of tiny decisions that none of the final mapmakers personally witnessed. Each measurement once had meaning in its own context, but when that context disappears, the measurement becomes a silent number. Each decision to record something was once defended by tradition, by a professional community, or by some form of political power. But when those structures collapse, the map becomes an orphaned object. It exists, yet no one remains who can fully explain it. And it is precisely that orphaned quality that makes maps like the Peary race map difficult for us to understand today. Not because they are too advanced, but because they come from a chain of knowledge that has been broken. They are the end point of an information stream that time has mostly swept away. When we look at them, and we do not only see what people once knew, we see more clearly what we have lost. In history, maritime knowledge was rarely preserved the way scholarly knowledge is preserved. It did not sit safely in grand libraries, copied steadily across centuries. It lived in sailors' experience, in delicate handwritten charts, in the memory of pilots, and within closed professional circles. When an empire fell, when a trade route was cut off, or when a generation lacked successors, entire systems of knowledge could disappear quickly, leaving very little behind for those who came later. For that reason, an accurate ancient map does not necessarily prove the existence of a mysterious golden age. It does not require a lost supercivilization, nor does it demand technologies that vanished without a trace. It may instead represent the surviving fragment of a slow, cumulative process, one that unfolded patiently across many generations. Geographic knowledge does not appear all at once. It is assembled voyage by voyage, correction by correction, mistake by mistake. Each journey adds a small adjustment. Each return refines what was drawn before. Over time, coastlines become less speculative and more disciplined, not because anyone fully understands the system, but because errors are gradually reduced through repetition. Such a process depends not on brilliance alone, but on continuity. It requires that observations be remembered, shared, and preserved long enough for comparison to occur. when that continuity holds accuracy, can emerge quietly without fanfare and without anyone recognizing that something exceptional is taking shape. But continuity is fragile. War can erase archives in a single season. Political collapse can scatter professional communities. Trade routes can close. Languages can disappear. And when these things happen, the accumulated knowledge does not degrade. Gracefully, it collapses abruptly. What remains afterward is rarely the process. What survives is the result. A map stripped of the long chain of experience that produced it becomes an object without context. Its precision appears sudden. Its logic seems unearned. And when viewed centuries later, it creates the unsettling impression that something is missing. That impression is not evidence that ancient people knew too much. It is evidence that we have inherited too little. We see the final outline, but not the countless revisions that shaped it. We see the coastline, but not the failed routes that corrected it. We see the ink, but not the arguments, debates, and corrections that once accompanied it. Placed side by side in the modern era, such fragments feel out of place because they no longer belong to a living tradition. They float free of explanation. And in that isolation, they invite speculation not because they defy human capability, but because they reveal the limits of historical memory. In this way, the discomfort provoked by an accurate ancient map does not point backward to a lost golden age. It points forward toward a quieter realization that human knowledge has always been more extensive than what survives, and that much of what we now call mystery is simply the shape left behind when continuity breaks. What is worth reflecting on is that this discomfort does not come from the mystical, but from the lack of continuity. If we had the entire chain of intermediate maps, the full records of voyages, the full debates and mistakes corrected over time, then the map would likely not feel controversial. It would simply be the final result of a long, understandable, entirely human process. But history is rarely that generous. It leaves fragments, forces us to reconstruct through inference, and demands that we accept gaps that cannot be filled. So when standing before an ancient map, the strongest feeling is not wonder, but humility. Humility before humanity's ability to understand and record the world, and humility before the reality that so much of that understanding never reached us. Maps, like Piri Reis, remind us that the world may once have been seen in ways more subtle, complex, and practical than we assume. Yet those ways of seeing now survive only as scattered fragments quietly suspended between past and present. The third piece of evidence, therefore, does not compel belief in the extraordinary. It compels acknowledgement of something more modest, that the history of human knowledge is full of gaps, and sometimes it is precisely those gaps that make a fragile map feel so heavy. If stone and sky reveal that ancient humans understood space and time, then medicine reveals something even more intimate, their understanding of the fragility of life itself. And it is precisely here between bone, blood, and breath that a new paradox emerges. How could societies with no germ theory, no modern anesthesia, no medical imaging, intervene directly in the human body with such striking precision and effectiveness? Across many regions of the world, from Africa and Europe to the Americas, archaeologists have uncovered prehistoric skulls bearing unmistakable evidence of trepanation, the deliberate opening of the skull. Round or square holes were carefully cut into cranial bone, their edges showing clear signs of healing after the procedure. This means the patient survived long enough for the body to begin repairing itself. Not one case, not two, but hundreds of cases spread across thousands of years. At first glance, drilling into the skull during prehistoric times sounds reckless, perhaps even hopeless. It evokes an image of desperation rather than knowledge, of blind violence rather than care. Modern intuition tells us that such an act, performed without anesthesia, sterile instruments, or anatomical charts, should almost always end in catastrophe. And yet it is precisely this apparent recklessness that forces us to pause and ask harder questions. How did they know where to drill, how deep to go, and most critically, when to stop? The human skull is not an inert block of stone. It is a layered living structure that protects the most delicate organ in the body. Beneath the outer bone lie membranes, blood vessels, and the brain itself structures where even a slight miscalculation can mean immediate death. A deviation of just a few millimeters can rupture a vessel, cause catastrophic bleeding, or permanently damage neural tissue. Drill too shallow, and the procedure achieves nothing. The pressure remains, the pain persists, the condition worsens. Drill too deep, and the intervention becomes fatal. In modern neurosurgery, these boundaries are navigated with imaging measurement and teams of specialists. In prehistory, none of that existed. There were no scans, no diagrams, no shared textbooks. And yet the archaeological record shows something deeply unsettling. A significant number of individuals survived these procedures long enough for bone regeneration to occur. The edges of the openings are smooth. Healing is visible. In some cases, there is evidence of multiple trepanations on the same individual, performed at different times, suggesting not only survival, but a level of trust in the procedure itself. This is not the signature of random chance. Luck may explain a single survival. It cannot explain patterns repeated across continents and millennia. It cannot explain consistency in placement depth and technique. The survival rates implied by the skeletal evidence point instead to accumulated experience knowledge gained slowly, painfully, and methodically through observation. Someone at some point learned that certain locations were safer than others. Someone learned to recognize the difference in resistance between outer bone and inner layers. Someone learned through sound vibration and tactile feedback when the threshold of danger was approaching. These skills are not instinctive. They are learned. They imply hands trained over years, guided by elders who had seen what worked and what failed. They imply memory, not abstract memory written down, but embodied memory stored in muscle touch and caution. A knowledge that could not be rushed and could not be easily transferred except through close apprenticeship and repetition. Equally important is what these procedures suggest about intention. Trepanation was not a wild act performed at random. It was targeted. Many skulls show openings in areas associated with trauma swelling or neurological symptoms. This suggests an early empirical understanding, however incomplete, that certain physical states could be alleviated by releasing pressure. The reasoning may have been framed in spiritual or ritual terms, but the practical outcome aligns with a real physiological effect. What we are seeing then is not ignorance punctuated by miracles. We are seeing a slow convergence between belief observation and bodily reality, trial and error refined into cautious practice, fear tempered by familiarity, risk narrowed by experience. And this is why the evidence is so difficult to dismiss. If prehistoric trepanation were merely reckless, the archaeological record would be dominated by failed attempts and unhealed wounds. Instead, it shows restraint, repetition, and survival. It shows that ancient practitioners operated close to the limits of danger and knew somehow where those limits were. That knowledge may not have been theoretical. It may not have been conscious in the way we define expertise today, but it was real. and it was reliable enough to be passed on. Which brings us back to the uncomfortable conclusion: these outcomes cannot be explained by luck alone. They point to a form of intelligence that does not rely on modern tools, but on time, patience, and a willingness to learn directly from the body, even when the cost of error was life itself. The smooth, even edges of the drilled openings and the visible signs of bone regeneration show that patients not only survived the intervention, but lived long enough for healing to begin. This implies a complex chain of skills: the ability to immobilize the head, to control applied force, to sense bone thickness through vibration and sound, and most critically, to know when to stop before crossing a lethal threshold. There were no measuring instruments, no medical imaging, no formal anatomical theory as we understand it today. There were only hands' careful observation and memory accumulated from previous attempts, memory transmitted from teacher to apprentice, and preserved in the bodies of those who survived. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of bacteria, no sterile operating rooms. But there was experience. There was repeated observation. There was the ability to recognize when a persistent headache, a traumatic injury, or an abnormal mental state could be released by relieving pressure within the skull. Even if the original motivation carried ritual or spiritual meaning, the biological outcome was very real: reduced pressure, reduced pain, and sometimes survival itself. Here, belief and practice did not cancel each other out. They overlapped, coexisting in a context where trial and error was the only available path to learning. As we move into ancient Egypt, the picture becomes clearer and more structured. No longer limited to scattered interventions inferred from skeletal remains, medicine begins to be written down. Among the oldest surviving medical texts, the Edwin Smith Papyrus stands out for its tone: cold, methodical, almost modern. There are no spells, no prayers, only description, diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. The text reads like a clinical report, presenting a case describing observable symptoms, assessing severity, and then outlining a course of action or stating plainly that the case is not to be treated. What is especially striking is the organization of the papyrus itself. Traumatic injuries are arranged from head to toe, as if the author were moving through the human body, guided by an implicit anatomical map. Descriptions of cranial trauma, spinal injuries, and limb damage show that the Egyptians recognized the relationship between the location of an injury and its functional consequences. When the text records that a wound to the head can result in loss of movement in the arms or legs, it does not need the term central nervous system to understand the causal link. They had observed it often enough to trust it. The apparent coldness of the text is not a lack of humanity, but evidence of method. It shows that medicine here was not driven solely by belief, but by classification and prognosis, knowing which cases could be treated and which could not, knowing when to intervene and when to let nature decide. This capacity for discernment, rather than any single surgical technique, is the true marker of a medical tradition that has moved beyond blind experimentation. What makes the transition from prehistoric trepanation to Egyptian medicine so significant is the continuity in how learning occurred. From direct intervention guided by experience to systematic documentation grounded in observation, humans did not leap forward magically. They accumulated knowledge. They remembered, they corrected mistakes, and when conditions allowed greater social stability, the development of writing, they began fixing that knowledge onto papyrus, so it no longer depended entirely on human memory. Here, a familiar feeling emerges, once again, the sense that these understandings arrived earlier than we expect, not because ancient people knew everything, but because they knew enough to intervene at the most fragile point of life, and still achieve a meaningful survival rate. And it is precisely this enough that forces us to reconsider how we tell the story of ancient medicine, not as a chain of superstition suddenly replaced by science, but as a long, uneven process in which observation and practice often ran far ahead of theory. The papyrus presents traumatic cases from head to foot in a striking anatomical order. Each case is described through concrete observation, what the wound looks like, how the patient responds, and what will happen if intervention is attempted, or if it is not. Some cases are bluntly declared not to be treated a rare honesty in ancient texts. This makes it clear that the document is not a collection of rituals, but a clinical handbook. Even more remarkable is the level of neurological understanding. The Edwin Smith Papyrus describes connections between head injuries and loss of function in the limbs. It records symptoms such as paralysis, convulsions, and altered consciousness concepts that modern medicine considers foundational. Without modern biological language, the Egyptians nonetheless observed the causal relationship between bodily structure and function. The issue is not that ancient people knew everything. They did not know germ cells or genes. The issue is that they knew enough to intervene systematically and to know when to stop. Such knowledge cannot form overnight. It requires hundreds of observations, trials, failures, memory, and transmission. More importantly, it requires a culture that considers observation of the human body legitimate and necessary, something not all ancient societies accepted. Here another question arises. If ancient medicine was merely ritual, why do such practical texts exist? And if it was practical, why did it appear so early when many later societies avoided bodily intervention altogether? This question does not point to a mysterious source of knowledge, but to an uncomfortable truth: the history of medicine is not linear. There are periods when humans observed deeply, and then periods when they turned away. That turning away may come from religion, social taboo, war, or the loss of record-keeping classes. When the conditions that protect knowledge disappear, medicine can regress, not because humans become less intelligent, but because they are no longer permitted to look, touch, and record. In that context, what survives from ancient Egypt appears too early for its time. Egypt was not alone. Many other civilizations left evidence of surprising medical understanding. Signs of orthopedic surgery, bone setting, and wound care appear in multiple regions independently. This suggests that medicine was not a single invention, but a universal human response to pain. When confronted with injury and disease, humans were compelled to learn even without formal science to guide them. What makes the fourth piece of evidence feel as though it should not exist within conventional historical thinking is not that it is impossible. It did exist, and the proof lies in human bone and inked papyrus. What makes it unsettling is that it contradicts the simple story that medicine only became serious with the arrival of modern science. The evidence shows that humans were once remarkably bold in intervening in the body, and that in many later periods they became more cautious. When prehistoric trepanation is placed alongside the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a quiet connection emerges. From crude but effective intervention to systematic documentation and clinical analysis, ancient medicine demonstrates a capacity we rarely attribute to the past: the capacity to learn from the human body through the human body. Without complete theory, they still accumulated enough knowledge to save lives. And at this point, the central question of the entire narrative returns. If ancient humans could understand their own bodies to such a degree, why are we surprised that they understood stone sky or the world itself? Perhaps the true shock is not their ability, but the distance between them and us, a distance created not only by time, but by layers of knowledge that were broken and lost. When we look at skulls that have healed at lines of black ink recording trauma on papyrus, the dominant feeling is not mystery, it is humility. Humility before people who lived in harsher worlds with fewer tools, yet still dared to place their hands on the most fragile aspects of life and learn from it. And if early medicine could reach such levels of understanding, then perhaps the limits we place on ancient intelligence need to be reconsidered, not to glorify the past, but to recognize that the history of knowledge is far more complex than the straight lines we are accustomed to drawing. After the human body and medical knowledge that seem almost impossibly early history leads us to another kind of evidence more subtle, more fragile, yet no less unsettling: art and symbols. If stone reveals technical ability, the sky reveals patience, maps reveal spatial memory, and medicine reveals boldness in the face of life itself, then art reveals how ancient humans imagined the world. And it is precisely here within drawings, carvings, and symbols that a quiet question emerges. Why do some symbols appear to arrive earlier than the intellectual context we usually assign to their time? Deep within the caves of Europe, where sunlight never reaches animal images created tens of thousands of years ago, still stand out clearly on rock walls. These are not clumsy sketches, but vivid beings: bison with heavy raised shoulders, horses galloping with elongated bodies pulled forward by motion, cave lions lowering their heads as if stalking prey. The proportions are so accurate that modern observers can immediately recognize each species, each posture, each phase of a familiar movement in the natural world. Prehistoric artists did not simply draw animals as generic symbols. They drew bodies in motion. Muscles are emphasized precisely where weight is born. Legs bend at the transitional moment between stillness and sudden movement. Heads, necks, and backs align along rational axes, creating a sense of mass and momentum. Such details cannot arise from imagination alone. They are the result of repeated observation of an eye that learned to see not just shape, but the rhythm of life itself. What is especially striking is that these images are often found in deep, hard-to-reach locations that did not serve daily living. This suggests that the art was not meant to decorate domestic space. It served another purpose, perhaps ritual, perhaps memory, perhaps a way of placing humans into a relationship with the animal world on which they depended. But whatever the purpose, the observational skill evident in these drawings is undeniable. It reveals a level of understanding of anatomy and movement that we usually associate with Renaissance artists, not with hunter-gatherer communities. When we step out of the darkness of caves and into civilizations with writing art, does not lose this sophistication. Instead, it changes form. In ancient Egypt, art abandons the depiction of fleeting moments in favor of another goal, order, and permanence. Reliefs on temple and tomb walls follow strict conventions of proportion, posture, and symbolism. Nothing is random. Every hand, every step, every direction of gaze is placed exactly where it is meant to be. Humans in Egyptian art are typically shown with the head in profile, the torso facing forward, and the legs striding sideways. To the modern eye, this is often mistaken for a lack of perspective or an underdeveloped technique. But this interpretation misses something crucial. This was not inability, but deliberate choice. Egyptians were not trying to reproduce how the human eye perceives a single moment. They sought to present the most complete representation of the human body, one in which each part is shown from its clearest, most recognizable angle, and carries its full symbolic meaning. Art here does not aim to record a passing instant. It aims to depict an eternal concept, the human being within the order of the cosmos, the human as a stable form with a fixed place in the realm of gods and time. For this reason, repetition becomes a virtue rather than a limitation. When a form is repeated for centuries, it does not signal stagnation, but a system of thought that treats consistency as sacred. If we place European cave art beside ancient Egyptian art, the contrast is obvious. Yet one essential similarity remains. Both demonstrate that ancient people knew exactly what they were doing. Prehistoric artists knew how to capture the living motion of animals. Egyptian artists knew how to abstract the human body into an expression of cosmic order. One looks toward the moment, the other toward eternity. But both require a capacity for observation and conceptual thinking, far beyond the naivety we often attribute to the past. It is at this point that art begins to feel like evidence out of time, not because it is modern, but because it does not fit the simple story that human intelligence progresses in a straight line from crude to refined. Cave paintings and Egyptian reliefs show that very early on, humans could choose among different modes of expression, depending on what they wished to preserve motion, or order the moment, or the eternal. When we look back at these works today, the strange feeling does not arise because we fail to understand the images. It arises because we begin to realize that the people who created them understood the world in ways profoundly different from our own, yet no less deep. Art, in this case, was not a placeholder waiting for science to arrive. It was a complete language of knowledge, a language powerful enough to preserve how humans perceived life, long before we learned to write it as formulas. Within this context, one symbol appears repeatedly and prominently: the Eye of Horus. To modern observers, it is often treated as a purely religious or mystical emblem. Yet when researchers compare its shape to anatomical cross-sections of the human brain, particularly the thalamus and structures associated with vision, a striking similarity emerges. Not a perfect match, but close enough to provoke discomfort. How could a society without modern neuroanatomy create a symbol that so closely resembles internal brain structures? Here, caution is essential. Egyptians did not draw the brain as modern science does, but they observed the human body during mummification. They saw internal structures, touched them, and assigned them symbolic meaning. Their art did not aim to document anatomy, but to transform observation into symbol. When that symbol is viewed through a modern lens, it acquires layers of meaning that ancient people may not have articulated in words, but nonetheless embedded in image. A similar phenomenon appears in ancient Mesopotamia in reliefs and carvings spanning Sumer Akkad and Assyria. On these stone panels, humans are no longer depicted in purely human form. They have wings, they bear animal heads, or they stand before geometric objects placed on pedestals held carefully in both hands, as if they were anything but ordinary items. Gods appear with rigid postures and forward gazes surrounded by symbols of power and cosmic order. For modern viewers, such images easily ignite imagination. Wings suggest flight. Objects on pedestals suggest devices. Non-human forms suggest other beings. But these hasty interpretations obscure something more important. This is a complete symbolic language, not a collection of images designed to astonish. In the Mesopotamian worldview, form does not depict biology, but cosmic function. Wings are not for flying through physical space. They symbolize the ability to traverse realms, heaven, earth, and the sacred. Animal heads do not describe hybrid creatures. They assign qualities humans lack, in full measure the strength of a bull, the vigilance of an eagle, the authority of a lion. Objects held in the hands are not machines, but symbols of law knowledge or bestowed power. Equally important is how these symbols are arranged. there is no visual chaos. Everything occupies a precise position within a rigid order. Central figures dominate. Secondary elements, wings, crowns, ritual objects do not overlap randomly, but form a visual structure easily read by those within the culture. This shows that Mesopotamian artists were not improvising. They were using a standardized symbolic system stable enough to persist for centuries. The issue, therefore, is not whether these images represent technology. The issue is the level of abstraction they display. To create a symbol that simultaneously conveys political authority, cosmic order, and sacred knowledge requires an understanding that images are not mere depiction, but language. A language capable of compressing multiple layers of meaning into a single form. Modern observers often underestimate this. Accustomed to writing equations and technical diagrams, we tend to assume that high abstraction only emerges with formal mathematics and science. Mesopotamian reliefs reveal another path abstraction through symbolic imagery, where meaning is shared, recognized, and transmitted without verbal explanation. This difference in language creates the sense of wrong timing. Modern viewers search these carvings for reflections of their own world machines, devices, anomalous beings. But Mesopotamians were not describing the physical world as we do. They were ordering the world conceptually, where gods, humans, and nature are linked by roles and functions, rather than separated categories. A hybrid being in Mesopotamian art is therefore not a question of what is it, but what does it represent? And the answer usually lies at the intersection of politics and cosmology. Rulership is understood as a reflection of cosmic order, and cosmic order must be expressed through images that transcend ordinary human form. Art here does not explain the world. It asserts that the world operates according to a defined order. What unsettles us about these symbols is not their mystery, but the level of symbolic thinking. They reveal something we rarely attribute to ancient societies. They show that people of that era did not think only through stories or rituals, but through structured visual systems capable of conveying abstract ideas of power law and the universe. When these systems collapse, when empires fall, languages lose their readers' rituals, cease the surviving images, begin to look like messages from another age. Not because they transcend time, but because they have lost the key to their interpretation. What we call mystery is in truth the gap between two systems of thought. In this sense, Mesopotamian art does not ask us to believe in the extraordinary. It asks us to recognize that there are ways of thinking about the world that do not rely on modern science, yet remain structured, logical, and sophisticated enough to endure for thousands of years. Perhaps it is our familiarity with the language of the present that makes the symbolic language of the past appear more alien than it truly is. In Mesoamerica, the Maya and Aztecs used art to encode astronomical and calendrical knowledge. Reliefs, paintings, and codices did not merely recount myths. They recorded cycles of the sun, moon, and Venus through imagery. A symbol represented not only a deity, but also a span of time, an astronomical event, or a ritual marker. Here, art was not illustration of knowledge. It was knowledge itself, compressed into images that could be transmitted across generations. What makes these symbols feel out of time to us is not that they are too modern, but that they do not fit our categories of ancient intelligence. They are not science in the modern sense, but neither are they naive art. They occupy an intermediate space where observation, belief, and collective memory merge. From the outside, they resemble messages from another era. Within their own context, they were the only viable means of preserving knowledge in a world without textbooks. Repetition is a crucial factor. These difficult symbols do not appear once and vanish. They recur across materials, locations, and centuries. Such repetition shows that they are not individual inventions, but components of protected systems of thought. When a symbol persists long enough, it becomes a tool for remembering teaching and confirming that the order of the world remains intact. Here, art ceases to be decoration. It becomes archive. In societies where writing is limited or reserved for elites, imagery becomes the primary vehicle for transmitting complex concepts without abstract language. This explains why certain symbols carry multiple layers of meaning and why they can be read differently across eras. This is what makes the fifth piece of evidence uncomfortable. If ancient art were merely emotional expression, its precision could be dismissed. But if it functioned as encoded knowledge, then we must ask, how deeply have we underestimated the abstract capacities of ancient humans? And if they could compress complex observations into images, then perhaps the boundary between art science and religion in the past was far less rigid than we assume. When we encounter out-of-time symbols, the dominant feeling is not amazement, but dissonance. We are looking through a different conceptual framework, a different language, while expecting the past to speak in the terms of the present. But the past has no obligation to do so. It speaks through images, rituals, repetition, and conventions we have forgotten how to read. Thus, the fifth piece of evidence does not invite belief in the extraordinary. It invites a recalibration of perspective. Perhaps these symbols are not out of time at all. Perhaps they belong to a different cognitive system, one in which art is not an accessory to knowledge, but its dwelling place. And when that system dissolves, the surviving images begin to look mysterious, not because they are alien, but because the context that once made them clear has vanished. When we place ancient art alongside stone sky maps and medicine, a picture slowly emerges, not of a super civilization, but of humans who learned to observe, remember, and transmit knowledge using every means available to them. And if those means do not resemble modern science, that does not make them inferior, only different, slower, more symbolic, yet never naive. After art and symbols, where knowledge is compressed into images, history brings us to a heavier kind of evidence, less ambiguous, and harder to deny the way human beings organize themselves. If the drawings in caves reveal the power of observation, and astronomical temples reveal the patience to endure time, then social organization reveals another capacity altogether: the ability to coordinate at large scale among people who do not share blood, do not share personal memory, and do not share immediate interests. And it is precisely here that a paradox becomes unmistakable. Many ancient societies seem to have reached a level of organization that by modern intuition should have appeared much later. In southern Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers curve through an arid plain, the first cities of humanity formed remarkably early. Sumer was not merely a cluster of houses, it was a complex network of temples, granaries, workshops, canals, and administrative machinery. To maintain such a city, people needed more than labor. They needed rules. Who does what? Who distributes food? Who decides when canals are dug, when levees are repaired, when soldiers are sent to protect water sources? What is striking is that these rules did not live only in personal memory. They were written down. The clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform found in Sumer, in quantities reaching tens of thousands, do not only tell myths or describe rituals. Most of them are dry accounts, records of how many measures of grain were delivered into temple storehouses, how many sheep were distributed to craftsmen, how many days of labor a person owed to the community, and the specific obligations attached to each household. These were not texts meant to inspire, they were tools of operation. Yet it is precisely this dryness that reveals something crucial. Record-keeping on such a scale shows that society had crossed the threshold beyond what human memory could manage on its own. No village chief, no powerful family could accurately remember thousands of overlapping obligations without a system. At that point, social organization was forced to rely on abstract structures, numbers, symbols, tables, rather than on personal relationships or direct familiarity. What unsettles us is not that such systems existed, but that they appear almost complete in the earliest layers of documentation. When archaeology traces cuneiform back toward its pre-writing stages, one might expect to see a slow development from counting tokens to simple marks to complex accounts. But the reality is not so clear. Even in the earliest clay tablets, we already see a relatively complete accounting system, as if society entered the stage of complex administration without leaving behind a full record of its experimental phase. Here, a gap appears. We can see the result, the records, the distribution systems, the obligations, but we cannot clearly see who designed the system, how long it took, or what debates and crises shaped it. The tablets do not tell us why one unit of measurement was chosen, or why a particular form of distribution became standard. They simply show that by the time they appear in the archaeological record, these rules had been widely accepted enough to operate an entire society. In that same very early period, thousands of kilometers from Mesopotamia, another society reached an equally surprising level of organization. In the Indus River Basin, cities such as Mohenjo-Daro were built according to an urban plan that feels almost modern. Streets intersect at right angles. Residential blocks are clearly divided. Underground drainage systems run beneath homes with slope and dimensions carefully calculated. These were not temporary fixes. They were designed for long-term use for a dense, stable community. Once again, what unsettles us is not the scale, but the synchronization. The entire city appears to follow a single planning logic. Homes, public spaces, storage facilities, and sewage systems are not random fragments, but parts of a whole imagined in advance. A city like this cannot be built through disconnected decisions made by each generation. It requires a shared vision, communicated, maintained, and enforced consistently over decades, even across generations. But as in Mesopotamia, the difficulty is that we do not know where that vision came from. The Indus civilization left behind very little readable text. Their script remains undeciphered. There are no chronicles, no clear names of kings, no detailed written myths explaining why the city was planned in that way. We can see the system, but we cannot see the designer. We can see the final result, but not the thinking process that led to it. This absence creates an uncanny feeling. Not because these societies are too mysterious, but because they are too silent about themselves. The surviving materials tell us a great deal about how society functioned, how much was collected, how distribution worked, how building was organized, but they tell us very little about the debates, experiments, or failures that produced these norms. History here feels like a book with its opening pages torn out, leaving us with a system already in motion, but without its origin story. This is what makes ancient social organization look too complex too early, not necessarily because it truly appeared suddenly, but because traces of its formative stage no longer exist or have not yet been found. When we cannot see the road, it is easy to feel that the destination arrived unexpectedly. Archaeology reminds us that this sense of surprise may be a product of documentary loss, not of an extraordinary leap. Therefore, when we look at Sumer's clay tablets or Mohenjo-Daro's right-angled streets, what matters is not imagining mystical origins, but acknowledging a humbler truth. We are looking at societies whose memory of their own formation has been eroded. These systems were learned, taught, argued over, and standardized, but much of that process disappeared along with the people who left no direct voice for later generations. And it is this silence more than complexity that makes ancient societies difficult to grasp. They remind us that history does not only lose monuments and objects, it also loses reasons, arguments, and the pathways of thought that created them. When those vanish, what remains, however logical and refined, can still feel as though it does not belong to its time, simply because we can no longer see the full story behind it. What is strange is that in these cities, the traces of centralized power are not as obvious as we might expect. There are no enormous palaces dominating the landscape. There are no towering statues of kings in the central square. Instead, there is a remarkable degree of uniformity in residential architecture. This suggests a form of social organization different from the familiar model of later empires, an organization grounded more in norms and rules than in a single ruling individual. Complex social organization is not expressed only through architecture or account books, but also through labor specialization. In very early ancient societies, there were already potters, metalworkers, weavers, merchants, priests, and administrators. A society can sustain this degree of specialization only if it has a distribution system reliable enough that people who do not directly produce food can still survive. That requires trust in social structure, trust that effort given today will be repaid tomorrow. Such trust does not arise naturally. It must be constructed through ritual law and symbol. In Mesopotamia, political power was tightly bound to divine order. In the Indus Valley, order seems tied more to communal norms than to personal rulers. Though the expressions differ, both reveal a high degree of abstract thinking about society, an understanding that each person is part of a structure larger than the self. When we widen the lens beyond the familiar cradles of civilization, the picture does not become simpler. In the Americas before metal and the wheel societies, such as the Maya or Inca, developed administrative systems, taxation, and large-scale mobilization of labor. In East Asia, early agricultural communities developed rituals, social stratification, and managerial structures before writing became widespread. These phenomena appeared independently in completely different geographic and ecological settings. This leads to an uncomfortable question: if complex social organization appears so early and so widely, then what truly limits its development? Is technology the deciding factor? Or do social conditions, war climate, environmental decline, play the greater role in causing such structures to collapse or be simplified? History shows that many ancient societies did not evolve continuously, but oscillated between different levels of complexity. A society may build a sophisticated managerial system over a few centuries and then lose much of that capacity within a few decades when conditions change. In that case, what remains abandoned cities, silted canals, shattered records, creates the impression that the organization arrived too early for its era, not because it could not exist, but because it was not sustained. This is what makes the sixth piece of evidence so important in the overall story. It shows that ancient people did not lack the ability to organize. They lacked long-term stability to protect the complex structures they created. When that stability disappears, organizational knowledge like medical knowledge, astronomical knowledge, or artistic knowledge can be lost far faster than stone or bone. Social organization, therefore, is not a fixed peak on an evolutionary ladder, something reached once and then permanently secured. It is a fragile equilibrium, one that exists only as long as it is actively sustained. Laws must be enforced. Trust must be renewed. Resources must continue to flow. Knowledge must be transmitted without interruption. The moment any of these threads frays, the structure begins to loosen. This fragility explains why history is not a clean arc of progress, but a landscape marked by rises and collapses, expansions and contractions, memory and forgetting. What we often call the fall of a civilization is rarely a single event. It is usually a gradual unraveling. Administrative routines become unreliable, specialized roles. Disappear, long-distance coordination weakens, and social trust erodes. Once that happens, a society does not simply revert to an earlier stage, it fragments. Skills that once required an entire system to support them can no longer be maintained by smaller, more localized communities. Complexity does not vanish because people become less intelligent, but because the conditions that made complexity viable no longer exist. This is why ancient societies can appear too complex too early when viewed from the present. We are accustomed to judging the past by what survived into later eras, not by what once flourished and then disappeared. We see the ruins, the broken tablets, the abandoned streets, but not the living processes that once animated them. When the middle chapters of history are missing, the opening pages can seem implausibly advanced, as if they belong to a different timeline altogether. In reality, what feels out of place is not the past, but our incomplete view of it. When we place this form of evidence beside the 5 earlier ones, stone sky maps, medicine, and art, a coherent pattern begins to emerge. Not the pattern of a vanished super-civilization endowed with impossible knowledge, but the pattern of human beings repeatedly pushing against the boundaries of what their circumstances allow. Again and again, people learn to observe closely, to remember collectively, to coordinate their actions, and to embed knowledge in tools, rituals, symbols, and institutions. When conditions are stable, when food is predictable, climate is forgiving, and conflict is limited, these experiments in complexity can reach remarkable heights. But history shows that these heights are never guaranteed permanence. A prolonged drought, a shift in trade routes, an epidemic, internal strife, or external invasion can undo centuries of accumulated organization within a few generations. When that happens, what survives is uneven. Stone lasts longer than systems. Art outlives administration. Symbols persist after the logic that once bound them together is forgotten. And so later, observers encounter fragments without context, precision without explanation, order without origin. Seen this way, history is not a steady upward climb toward modernity. It is a series of attempts, some sustained, some short-lived, to organize life more effectively. Sometimes those attempts succeed long enough to leave deep archaeological footprints. Sometimes they fail, quickly leaving only faint traces. Progress is not erased, but it is interrupted. Knowledge is not destroyed, but it is often compressed, distorted, or lost as the structures that supported it collapse. This perspective forces a shift in how we think about the past. Instead of asking why ancient people advanced so quickly, we might ask how often similar levels of complexity arose and how frequently they were lost. Instead of imagining history as a straight line from simplicity to sophistication, we begin to see it as a rhythm, accumulation, stabilization, disruption, and rebuilding. Each cycle inherits fragments from the previous one, but never the whole. In this light, the discomfort we feel when confronting ancient complexity is not evidence of something unnatural or anomalous. It is a reminder of how selective survival is. We live at the far end of one of these cycles, surrounded by technologies and institutions that feel permanent only because they are familiar. But history suggests that permanence is an illusion. Complexity is always provisional, always dependent on conditions that can change. What ancient societies ultimately reveal when viewed together is not a mystery about the past, but a truth about humanity itself. The capacity for complex organization is not rare, nor is it uniquely modern. What is rare is continuity, the uninterrupted chain of stability required to preserve that organization across centuries. And when continuity breaks, the past can look impossibly advanced, simply because we are seeing only the peaks with the valleys erased by time. In that sense, the evidence does not ask us to believe in lost wonders. It asks us to recognize a humbler, more unsettling reality. Human beings have always been capable of far more than we tend to credit them for, and they have always been one disruption away from losing it. And that is why the sixth piece of evidence does not conclude anything. It simply leaves us with one final question for this part of the story. If ancient people once organized societies at such levels of complexity, what is it in the modern world that makes us believe such complexity is rare and late? Perhaps what is rare is not the capacity to organize, but the capacity to keep an organization intact long enough for it to become ordinary in humanity's memory. After 6 chapters, one thing becomes clear. It is not any single piece of evidence that makes this story difficult to explain, but the resonance created when all of them are considered together. A precisely constructed stone monument might be an exception. A deep understanding of astronomy could be the result of long-term observation. A map or an early medical practice might be the rare achievement of an unusual community. But when all of these appear simultaneously in many different places within geographical and cultural contexts that are independent of one another, the question can no longer be avoided. That question is not, who brought this knowledge? Nor is it, were ancient people intelligent enough? The more accurate and more uncomfortable question is this: are we truly understanding how knowledge appears, persists, and disappears across human history? When confronted with achievements that seem too complex for their time, we generally face 3 broad possibilities. These possibilities are not mutually exclusive hypotheses, but rather 3 lenses each illuminating a different aspect of the problem. None of them has enough evidence to serve as a final conclusion, yet each is reasonable, and each is supported by what we have already observed. The first possibility is the least sensational, but it demands the greatest humility from the modern observer, that all of these achievements were genuinely invented within their own time by the people who lived in that era. No mysterious leaps, no knowledge imported from elsewhere, only observation, experimentation, failure, and adjustment repeated patiently over very long spans of time. We tend to evaluate intelligence through speed. Modern societies are accustomed to measuring progress in decades, sometimes even in years. Each generation expects to surpass the previous one more quickly. We are comfortable with upward graphs, clear milestones, and labeled revolutions stamped with dates. But most of human history operated according to a different rhythm, one in which progress was not felt within a single lifetime, but only revealed across many generations. An ancient community might observe the same sky for hundreds of years, not in order to discover new laws, but in order to remember. They did not need to uncover a new rule each night. They needed to be certain that the rule did not change. When a star returned to the same position at the same time of year, generation after generation, trust slowly formed. Knowledge in this context was not a flash of individual insight, but the patience of an entire community. A river was treated in much the same way. It was not studied in the modern sense. It was lived with, each flood, each shift in course, Each newly formed sandbank was remembered not through precise maps, but through stories, rituals, and practical experience. Over many generations, these scattered memories condensed into hydrological understanding, even if no one called it by that name. When a levee was placed in the right location, or a canal was opened at the right moment, this was not an instant invention, but the result of hundreds of small observations passed down without formal theory. Techniques transmitted from parent to child, from master to apprentice, were rarely taught through complete explanations. They were taught through doing, through correction, through subtle adjustments. A hand movement altered slightly, a cutting angle refined just enough, a pause extended by a few breaths. Individually, these changes did not look revolutionary, but repeated across generations, they could produce techniques whose origins are nearly impossible to reconstruct. Within this slow rhythm, knowledge does not accumulate linearly. It settles, it becomes habit, then norm. And once it becomes norm, no one clearly remembers why it is done that way. People simply know that this is the way that works. At that point, the technique is no longer regarded as an invention. It becomes tradition. And tradition, unlike invention, rarely leaves a trace of its birth. This creates a paradox for modern observers. When we encounter a refined technique in the archaeological record, we search for its beginning. But in many cases, that beginning has dissolved into time. It is no longer an event, but a long process without clear boundaries. The technique appears as if it had always existed, even though it is the result of countless unrecorded refinements. This may explain why so many ancient achievements feel as though they arrived too early, not because they exceeded the capabilities of their creators, but because they exceed our expectations of how development is supposed to look. We are accustomed to visible leaps. Ancient people were accustomed to slow erosion through experience. We are used to recording everything. They were used to letting knowledge live within action. Seen through this temporal lens, the question, how did they manage to do this, begins to change its tone. Perhaps they did not manage it in the way we imagine. Perhaps they became people who could do it through the patient repetition of daily life. And once a community became that kind of community, the results it left behind, no matter how sophisticated, no longer required a clear moment of invention to exist. This difference in temporal rhythm is what often makes the past feel alien. Not because it is mysterious, but because it moves more slowly than we are used to seeing. When we measure civilizations by decades, we miss what only becomes visible when measured in centuries. And perhaps many things we describe as not supposed to exist at that time are simply products of a pace of life that we no longer have the patience to experience. In this context, knowledge does not need to be invented in the modern sense. It settles. It accumulates like sediment. And when it reaches a point of sufficient stability, it is carved into stone, standardized into ritual, or recorded as a system. When we first encounter it in the archaeological record, that is not when it appeared, but when it had become stable enough to endure. From this perspective, the feeling that these achievements arrived too early reflects more about modern impatience than about ancient abnormality. We are accustomed to acceleration. Ancient people were accustomed to waiting, and perhaps it was precisely this ability to wait that allowed them to reach levels of refinement that we rarely attempt today. The second possibility does not negate the first, but adds a crucial factor: the loss of evidence. The history available to us is not the total history that once existed. It is what remains after thousands of years of erosion. Stone survives, clay survives, metal survives, but wood, leather fibers, early paper, and most importantly, oral transmission do not. If the earliest stages of knowledge were preserved using fragile materials, then their disappearance is almost inevitable. What archaeology preserves in that case are the mature phases of knowledge. This creates the illusion of sudden emergence. Like opening a book whose opening chapters have been torn out, the reader feels the story begins too abruptly, too completely. In many of the cases discussed, we see outcomes without processes, measurement systems without visible experimentation, urban planning without the debates that shaped it, stable rituals without evidence of their formative stages. From this perspective, asking whether something was invented in that era may be a misleading question. It may well have been invented in that era, but the evidence of its formation was not preserved. What we are seeing is not the moment of creation, but the moment of stabilization. History tends to preserve stability, while the disorder that precedes it disappears. The third possibility is more cautious and more sensitive. Because it is easily misunderstood, knowledge may have been passed down from earlier societies or from previous civilizations, rather than reinvented entirely from scratch in each era. This does not require a global civilization erased by a massive catastrophe, nor does it require advanced technology beyond human capacity. It requires only something that has occurred repeatedly in human history in complete rupture. History rarely proceeds through absolute breaks. When a society collapses, it does not fall like a switch being turned off. It erodes. It fragments. Power structures fail long before daily life does. Cities may be abandoned, their walls crumbling and their streets filling with dust. But people do not disappear with them. They move, they resettle. They carry with them habits formed over lifetimes. States dissolve, laws lose their authority, administrations vanish, but professions continue. Someone still knows how to shape stone so it bears weight. Someone still knows how to read the land for water. Someone still remembers when to plant, when to harvest, and when not to challenge the river. Writing may be forgotten or become restricted to a tiny elite, but the body remembers. Hands remember. Repetition remembers. Skills that are practiced daily do not require explanation to survive. They require only usefulness. In these transitional periods after collapse, before renewal, knowledge does not exist as complete theory or articulated system. It exists as lived practice. It survives because it works, not because it is understood. A builder in such a world may not know the mathematical reason why a certain proportion distributes weight safely, but he knows through inheritance of trial and failure that deviating from it causes walls to crack and roofs to fall. The proportion is not an equation in his mind. It is a feeling in his hands, a rule embedded in habit. When asked why it must be done this way, the answer is simple and sufficient, because otherwise it fails. Knowledge here is not explanatory. It is corrective. It exists to prevent disaster, not to describe reality. A healer may not possess anatomical diagrams or a conceptual framework of organs and systems, but knows through accumulated observation which parts of the body are dangerous to cut, which wounds must be left alone, and which interventions relieve suffering. This knowledge is carried in caution, in taboos, in warnings passed from mentor to apprentice. Do not cut there. Do not touch this when it swells. These are not superstitions born of ignorance, but compressed conclusions drawn from pain, death, and survival. The theory has vanished, but the boundary remains. A community may forget why a ritual began, or what event first gave it meaning, but still knows that abandoning it leads to instability. When the ritual is skipped, conflict increases. When it is performed, tension eases. Over time, the explanation fades, but the effect does not. The ritual survives not because it is understood, but because it stabilizes. In this way, social knowledge, how to keep cohesion, how to prevent fracture, persists even when its original logic is lost. Such knowledge is not stored in texts. It is stored in bodies, in gestures, in routines, repeated without reflection. It is embodied memory. An embodied memory is remarkably resilient. It does not require literacy. It does not require institutions. It only requires continuity of practice. As long as people keep building healing farming and gathering fragments of older knowledge can persist invisibly beneath the surface of a new society. When a new social order eventually emerges, it does not begin from a blank slate. It inherits these fragments without knowing their origins. Over generations, the fragments are rationalized, reinterpreted, or mythologized. A rule of thumb becomes a sacred proportion. A practical caution becomes a religious taboo. A stabilizing ritual becomes tradition. By the time writing returns or archaeology looks back, the knowledge appears fully formed, disconnected from its long, fragile journey through collapse. This is why certain achievements appear to arrive without visible development. Not because they were created suddenly, but because their formative stages lived in periods that did not preserve records. What survives is not the story of learning, but the residue of having learned. And when we encounter that residue without its context, it feels uncanny, too refined, too deliberate, too complete for the moment in which it appears. In reality, it is neither miraculous nor alien. It is human knowledge doing what it has always done best, adapting to loss, compressing itself into practice, and surviving long enough to re-emerge, changed, simplified, but still functional, when conditions allow it to surface again. When a new society forms upon these survivors, what is inherited is not a complete system, but fragments, techniques without theory, symbols without original meaning, procedures repeated without remembered context. Over time, these fragments merge into the new society and become natural parts of it. This process creates the impression that knowledge suddenly appears in a historical context without visible development. In reality, it is resurfacing, but because the foundational memory has eroded, it appears as independent invention, or worse, as something out of place. Crucially, this possibility does not require perfect transmission. Knowledge degrades over time. With each rupture, it loses depth language and explanatory power. What remains are practical rules effective enough to survive, but no longer fully understood. From this angle, early complexity is not evidence of extraordinary origins, but of layered history. Humans do not always begin from zero. More often they begin from what remains, however fragmentary, of those who came before. This also explains why similar forms of knowledge appear in different places, with variations but shared features. Not because of a single source, but because similar problems recur and effective solutions tend to be retained. This possibility becomes dangerous only when pushed too far, when partial inheritance is mistaken for perfect transmission and inflated into unfounded speculation. Kept within historical limits, it expresses something deeply human. We remember through doing, not only through writing. And when practice outlasts documentation, the history of knowledge will always contain gaps. These three possibilities do not exclude one another. They may all apply simultaneously. A structure may result from long, independent observation. An organizational system may incorporate inherited practices. A symbol may blend new creation with old memory. History does not operate in clean categories. It operates in gray zones. This chapter, therefore, does not attempt to select a correct explanation. It does one thing only: it reframes the question. When we say that something should not exist at that time, we may be revealing more about our expectations than about the past itself. We expect the past to be simple, linear, and slow. The evidence suggests something far more complex, fragmented, and forgetful. If there is a lesson drawn from the 6 chapters before this one, and from this chapter itself, it is not a hidden answer. It is a reminder human knowledge does not only advance, it also disappears. And when what disappears outweighs what remains, what survives entirely. Human-made can still look as though it does not belong to its time. When every hypothesis is set aside, when every speculation is stripped away, and when the great questions have been opened but not forced into premature answers, what remains is not emptiness. What remains is the human being, not the human of legend, not the human elevated into a transcendent symbol, but the human of flesh and bone living in harsher conditions than we often imagine across spans of time, longer than we tend to acknowledge, and with a depth of adaptability that we rarely give full credit to. After 6 bodies of evidence and 3 possible explanations, one thing becomes clear: much of what makes the past appear mysterious lies not in the past itself, but in the way we approach it. We are accustomed to seeking neat answers. We prefer clear timelines, linear, evolutionary paths, and inventions that can be attributed to named individuals. But human history rarely operates in that manner. It is messier, slower, and far more vulnerable to forgetting. When we remove the hypothesis of an external source of knowledge, when we no longer need a lost supercivilization to explain what we see, what does not disappear is the complexity of how humans learn. On the contrary, that process becomes even more striking. For once extraordinary explanations are set aside, we are forced to confront a less glamorous but more honest reality. Human knowledge develops unevenly, persists unstably, and is preserved very selectively. Precise stone constructions no longer appear as traces of something beyond humanity. They become evidence of collective patience. A community may not know why a particular proportion works, but it knows that if the proportion is changed, everything collapses. Knowledge here does not need to be understood in order to survive. It only needs to be repeated long enough. And when repeated long enough, it becomes tradition, then standard practice, and eventually something no one thinks to question. Astronomical understanding ceases to look like evidence of intelligence far ahead of its time, once we place it back into its lived context. It becomes the natural outcome of inhabiting a world where the sky is not an object of curiosity, but the primary framework through which time itself is experienced. In a society without printed calendars, without mechanical clocks, without artificial light to blur the boundary between night and day, the heavens are not optional knowledge. They are infrastructure, the rising and setting of the sun, the slow drift of the stars, the changing face of the moon. These are not abstract phenomena to be studied occasionally, but signals that regulate work, rest, travel, ritual, and survival. When the sky is the only clock, time cannot be approximate. A mistake of a few days in planting can mean starvation. A misreading of seasonal change can expose a community to cold flood or drought. Under such conditions, precision is not a luxury or a scholarly pursuit. It is enforced by consequence. Communities that fail to read the sky accurately do not merely misunderstand nature, they are selected against by it. Over generations, attentiveness sharpens, memory deepens. Patterns are not only noticed but verified again and again, not by theory, but by lived repetition. In this environment, Astronomical accuracy is not extraordinary. It is inevitable. The same logic applies when we look beyond the sky. Ancient maps, early medical practices, complex artistic symbols, and large-scale social structures all appear less enigmatic when we stop treating them as isolated intellectual breakthroughs. When viewed without invoking external sources or lost supercivilizations, they reveal a shared characteristic. They are not knowledge in its raw exploratory state. They are knowledge that has already been compressed. Compression is what allows knowledge to survive under harsh conditions. It is what makes memory durable when materials are fragile and lifespans are short. Knowledge that remains expansive, full of explanations, caveats, and theoretical context is vulnerable. It requires teachers' texts and uninterrupted transmission. Compressed knowledge, by contrast, can move silently through time. It can be carried without explanation, preserved without full understanding, and transmitted even when language literacy or social structure changes. Images compress observation into form. A drawing can hold anatomical accuracy, environmental awareness, or astronomical alignment without requiring words. It can be copied by someone who does not fully grasp why it works, yet still reproduce it faithfully. Rituals compress instruction into action. A sequence of movements performed at the same time each year can encode seasonal timing, social coordination, or environmental response without ever articulating the underlying logic. Rules compress experience into constraint. Do not build beyond this line. Do not cut at this angle. Do not touch this part of the body. Each rule may be the residue of many past failures, distilled into a single prohibition that no longer needs to be argued. Habits are the most compressed form of all. When knowledge becomes habit, it no longer requires conscious recall. It lives in the body. A hand moves in a certain way because it has always done so. A community gathers at a certain place because it always has. At this stage, knowledge is no longer remembered, it is enacted. And enacted knowledge can survive astonishing amounts of cultural disruption. It can outlive writing systems, belief structures, and political orders. This compression comes at a cost. The more tightly knowledge is compressed, the more it loses its ability to explain itself. A technique passed down through practice may remain effective long after its rationale has vanished. A ritual may be performed faithfully even when its original purpose is forgotten. A symbol may be repeated for centuries while its meaning shifts fragments or becomes opaque. What survives is function, not explanation. This is the point at which modern observers begin to feel unease. We encounter precision without documentation, sophistication without theory, order without an apparent origin story. To us trained to expect explicit reasoning, named authors, and written justification, compressed knowledge feels incomplete. It looks like something is missing because something is. What is missing is not intelligence, but context. When we look at ancient achievements and ask, how could they know this? We often assume that knowing must resemble our own processes. Formal education, explicit models, recorded theory. But compressed knowledge follows a different logic. It does not emerge as a sudden insight. It settles gradually, like sediment, layer upon layer, until it becomes stable enough to support structures above it. By the time it appears in the archaeological record, it is already mature. The uncertainty, debate, and experimentation that produced it have been erased by time. Seen this way, ancient accomplishments do not demand extraordinary explanations. They demand patience. They require us to accept that human learning does not always announce itself, does not always preserve its own history, and does not always leave behind the steps by which it was achieved. Much of what the past knew, it knew quietly through repetition, correction, and survival until knowledge ceased to feel like knowledge at all and became simply the way things are done. What remains then is not evidence of something beyond humanity, but evidence of humanity operating under different constraints. A world where knowledge had to be durable rather than explicit, where memory lived in bodies rather than books, where precision emerged not from instruments but from necessity, and where the most successful ideas were not those that could be explained best, but those that could survive longest. This compression is not an academic choice. It is a survival strategy shaped by harsh constraints. In societies where life expectancy is short, where literacy belongs to only a small fraction of the population, and where writing surfaces rot, burn, or crumble, knowledge cannot rely on explanation. Explanation requires time specialists and continuity. What survives instead is what can move without commentary, what can be seen, repeated, and embodied. An image can outlive a text because it does not require grammar. A child can recognize a shape long before they can read a sentence. A ritual can outlast an explanation because it embeds meaning in action rather than language. You do not need to know why you walk a certain path, light a certain fire, or speak a certain phrase. You only need to know when and how. A daily habit can cross generations precisely because it does not demand understanding. It survives by becoming automatic. In this way, knowledge shifts form. It stops living in statements and begins living in behavior. It becomes something the body remembers, even when the mind does not. The hands learn before the words. The feet remember routes the tongue can no longer describe. What matters is not whether the next generation can explain the practice, but whether they can perform it well enough for life to continue. But this strength comes with a cost. The more tightly knowledge is compressed, the more it sacrifices its ability to explain itself. Compression preserves function, not meaning. When a technique is passed down purely through demonstration, the learner may replicate it flawlessly while remaining ignorant of its deeper logic. They know that it works, but not why it works. And as long as it continues to work, the question of why becomes unnecessary. When a rule is followed, because it has always been this way, the original conditions that made the rule sensible slowly disappear from memory. The rule remains, but it floats free of its origin. Over time, it may be enforced more rigidly than ever, precisely because its rationale is no longer accessible. What was once a practical response becomes a moral obligation. What was once adaptive becomes sacred. Symbols undergo an even more dramatic transformation. When a symbol is repeated across centuries, it accumulates layers. Each generation projects new meanings onto it, often without realizing that older meanings ever existed. The symbol grows heavier, not clearer. Its original reference point, whether ecological, anatomical, or social, may vanish entirely, leaving behind an image that feels profound but opaque. At that stage, the symbol no longer explains knowledge. It demands interpretation. This is how clarity turns into mystery without anything supernatural occurring. Nothing new is added. Something old is simply lost. The chain of explanation thins until it snaps. What remains is a form that still functions, still commands respect, still organizes behavior, but no longer carries its own instruction manual. From the outside, this looks like a paradox. How can people possess techniques they cannot explain? How can societies preserve precision without theory? But from the inside, there is no paradox at all. There is only continuity. As long as the practice produces results, explanation is optional. Survival rewards effectiveness, not understanding. And this is why compressed knowledge is so often misread by later observers. We encounter the result without the process, the form without the story of its formation. We see a stable structure and assume a sudden leap. In reality, what we are seeing is the end point of a long erosion knowledge, worn smooth by repetition, polished by necessity, and stripped of everything that could not be carried forward easily. Compression then does not merely preserve knowledge, it transforms it. It turns insight into habit, reasoning into ritual, and understanding into muscle memory. And when enough time passes, what was once learned deliberately begins to look as though it arrived fully formed, when in fact, it is simply all that remained after explanation had no place left to live. In that sense, the mystery does not lie in how ancient people knew so much. It lies in how much explanation a society can afford to lose and still function before later generations mistake endurance for enigma. And it is precisely at this point that the sense of mystery arises. Not because something inhuman is present, but because the chain of explanation has been severed. We see the result, but no longer see the reason. We see the structure, but no longer see the process. We see sophistication, but no longer see the small errors that once led to it. That gap is not evidence of the supernatural. It is evidence of lost memory. When writing disappears, more than information disappears with it. Ways of thinking vanish as well. When tradition is broken, not only rituals are forgotten, but the social logic that once supported them dissolves. When social context is gone, actions that were once entirely reasonable begin to look inexplicable. And when all of this happens at once, what remains, though entirely human in origin, starts to look like fragments from an alien logic. Yet that logic is not extraterrestrial. It is the logic of a slower world, one in which knowledge was inseparable from daily life. In that world, people did not learn and then live. They learned by living. Knowledge did not reside in books, but in ways of walking, building healing, and organizing communities. When knowledge is embedded so deeply in life, it does not need daily explanation. But when life changes, that knowledge loses its anchor. For modern observers accustomed to knowledge that is clearly presented, sourced, attributed, and accompanied by theory, encountering compressed knowledge is a disorienting experience. We try to decode it using our own tools, forgetting that it was created within a different linguistic system. Unable to read that system, we mistake the silence of the past for mystery and the absence of data for the extraordinary. Perhaps most of what we label as things that should not exist at that time are simply achievements created to function, not to be understood centuries later. They were designed to serve their contemporaries, not to explain themselves to posterity. And when that original purpose disappears, what remains, however effective, becomes difficult to read. Seen this way, mystery is no longer an invitation to speculation, but a reminder of the limits of modern perception. It reminds us that we are not only trying to understand the past, but also trying to translate a compressed system of knowledge from the language of lived experience into the language of analysis. And in any such translation, loss of meaning is nearly unavoidable. Once this is recognized, a subtle shift occurs. We no longer need to ask what the past knew that exceeded humanity. Instead, we begin to ask, what did the past know in ways we no longer practice? This question does not make the past more mystical. It makes the present more humble. And perhaps that humility is precisely what is needed when we stand before the remaining traces of a world that operated by a different rhythm, a different logic, yet was entirely human. Stripping away every hypothesis also forces us to abandon another illusion, the belief that knowledge always accumulates upward. History shows the opposite. Knowledge can be lost far more quickly than it is created. A system of measurement can vanish within a century. A construction technique can disappear after only a few generations if the conditions for practicing it no longer exist. A method of social organization can collapse simply because the environment changes. When that happens, the next society does not begin at the highest point previously reached. It begins with what remains, and what remains rarely reflects the full complexity that once existed. This is why human history looks like a series of disjointed leaps rather than a smooth curve. Not because people became less intelligent, but because collective memory was fractured. Viewed in this light, the question, what should not have existed at that time, begins to change its meaning. Perhaps the issue is not the timing of existence, but the timing of remembrance. We know only what survived, and what survived does not represent everything that once was. It represents only what was durable enough to endure the erosion of time. What remains after removing every hypothesis, therefore, is not certainty. It is humility. Humility before the capacities of ancient humans. Humility before the scale of historical loss. And humility before our own limits in reconstructing the past. We cannot demand that history tell us everything in full. We can only learn to listen to what it still has the strength to whisper. And perhaps this is the greatest value of stories about ancient mysteries. Not because they reveal hidden truths, but because they force us to reconsider how we understand knowledge itself. They remind us that modern science is not the sole measure of intelligence. It is a powerful language, but it is not the only language humans have ever used to comprehend the world. In the ancient world, knowledge was not divided into science, art, religion, or technology. It was a single whole. When a community built, it simultaneously calculated, observed, believed, and remembered. When a society collapsed, that body of knowledge did not dissolve evenly. It shattered into uneven fragments. Some pieces survived longer, others vanished quickly. And when the remaining fragments are viewed through modern eyes, they create the impression that something is out of place. But perhaps what is out of place is not the past. It is our expectation of the past. We want the past to be simple, so the present looks progressive. We want the past to be deficient, so what we possess today feels exceptional. History rarely serves that psychological need. It reminds us that humans have always been human creative, mistaken adaptive, and forgetful. As this video comes to a close, what matters is not which of the three possibilities you choose to believe. What matters more is accepting that no single choice is required. History does not demand belief. It demands caution. And sometimes the most honest conclusion is to admit that some questions will remain open, not because the answers are too distant, but because the data needed to close them no longer exists. What remains when every hypothesis is removed? Perhaps only a simple, uncomfortable recognition humans once knew more than we often assume, and we have forgotten more than we like to admit. Not because anything was deliberately hidden, but because time has no obligation to preserve everything. And within that, forgetting the remaining fragments of the past need not become mysteries. They can become reminders that knowledge must not only be created, but also cared for, because if it is not one day, even what we take for granted today may appear as something that should not have existed at that time in the eyes of those who come after us. After every hypothesis has been laid out, after every speculation has been weighed, and after the most uncomfortable questions have finally been spoken aloud, what remains is not a clear answer. History rarely grants us complete certainty. It leaves gaps, and it is precisely those gaps that keep human beings searching. It may be that everything you have just heard was truly created by human hands through patience, collective memory, and generations that followed one another. but are no longer visible to us. Or it may be that we still do not fully understand the path that knowledge once traveled before it reached us today. But the most important thing does not lie in the final answer. It lies in how we choose to ask the question. Because the moment we rush to assign everything we cannot explain to some force outside of humanity, we also unintentionally strip away the creativity, intelligence, and depth of the very people who lived before us. Perhaps the discoveries that should not exist do not ask us to believe in anything extraordinary. They ask only that we be more humble in the face of the past. If you are listening to this story tonight somewhere in the world, let these questions stay with you a little longer. You do not need to answer them right now. And if you would like to share, I would truly like to know, where are you listening from? And at this moment where you live, what time is it? Wishing you a peaceful night's rest.